Hi, I'm Ian Cook, Dr. Ian Cook. I'm a political scientist, although I'm not absolutely comfortable with that word, relying on the work of climate scientists. I'm using what they're telling me about climate change in particular, and I'm saying, look, these are the consequences that are going to follow between the period 2030 to 2130 of what the climate scientists are telling me. So, this is in my book, The Politics of the Final 100 Years of Humanity, 2030 to 2130, and it's to sort of explain this book that I've made this and the other videos in, I guess, what is might well be understood as a series. Here I want to talk about the politics of science and the science of politics. They're not the same, they're not really that directly related, they both just happen to have science in the title. Basically, this is sort of two videos, it's not really one, there's no connection between the first part, the politics of science, well, there's no real direct connection, and the second part, the science of politics. The first part, is talking about what I think of as the arrogance of scientists. Now, I think that's contributed to the problems we're facing. In the second part, I own up to the fact that the political institutions and the people who study those political institutions, people like me, political scientists, the ways we think about political institutions, the way we study political institutions, actually makes them incapable, or makes it hard for us to think of them as institutions that can address catastrophic human-caused environment change, because that requires major social reconstruction, radical change at the root, and that's not what political institutions do, and that's not what political scientists study. And those two factors, I think, have contributed to us moving toward this final 100 years of humanity. And so I want to sort of talk about that, or I did talk about that in the book, and I'll explain that in this video. Before I go further, I have to acknowledge that this land was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about the fact that science is much more political than scientists make out, that there's much more power present in there. And most importantly, one of the consequences of that is that scientists don't give us truth. They don't give us absolute capital T truth. They don't know for sure. They give us levels of certainty. And their certainty is highly reliable, and we've been relying on it for a very long time. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that we rely on certainty. But that's, I think, had an effect on the conversation around climate science, and I want to talk about it in the first half of this video, or part of this video. In the second one, I want to talk about the limitations on political institutions and the limitations on the way political institutions are studied. So in this video, I want to talk about mostly political institutions, that they don't produce radical change, but also about the fact that people like me, people who study political institutions, don't really study them in such a way that radical change is something that we're looking for or talking about. And for the most part then, our institutions can't make radical change, and we don't talk about them as lacking the ability to introduce radical change. More importantly, we've lost the ability to talk about them as doing good, morally good things. And that's another aspect, both of the practice of politics and the study of politics. Morality, in a sense, is largely absent, and that has had consequences that we're going to see. Before I go further, particularly for this video, I need to explain that all the views I present here, and my views about scientists, I guess, are amongst my more controversial views, all the views I press here, and the pieces I've written for Medium, all my own, totally my responsibility. No one else's. Especially when it comes down to my views about scientists and viruses, which, as I say, are somewhat controversial. So here we are then, the science of politics, the politics of science, the two things that I want to look at in this video. I want to start off with the science of politics, the politics of science, I should say, because I want to talk about the fact that, for me anyway, scientists are smug, lying bastards who think inside boxes. I'm going to explain that. It actually starts with thinking inside boxes, and it goes back. And the point I'm trying to make is that scientists have traded on producing truth, giving us knowledge. And they've got status and position as a result of that. And the whole reason that we started wanting to be a political science rather than just a study of politics was because calling yourself a scientist was actually, made you more respectable, made you more fundable. And so if you wanted to get money out of governments, you would say, we're a science because we can give you scientific truths. Okay, but that's all a lie. That's all a con. None of that's true. And I didn't acknowledge this in the book, and I do in this video, that I just did not see that the IPCC had picked that up. And they'd understood that, and they changed their language. I was reading the change language without acknowledging this gives you significance of the change language, and I want to do that in this video today. It isn't in the book. It's just here because, as I say, it was only in the process of putting these videos together that I sort of realised my mistake, and that I owed the IPCC an apology. Okay. Scientists think inside boxes, as I've said, is the sort of starting point for this. And I got this idea from my favourite quantum. I think quantum gravity is Lee Smolins' particular expertise, but Lee Smolins' work, Time Reborn, is really important. I really was influenced by that in terms of my thinking about time, because I'm sort of really interested in the concept of time. But I was reading his book, and I came across this passage. Most of what we know about nature has come from experiments. And so, this is important, that the scientist, in order to interrogate nature, creates experiments, constructs, and they might just be particular moments of observation, very powerful observation. But they're specific moments for interrogating the world, and this is part of what Smile was talking about. Because he sort of goes on to say, most of what we know about nature has come from experiments that artificially mark off and isolate a phenomenon from the continual world of the universe. And this is just scientific practice. I mean, he'll talk about it as I'll show in a minute, physics in a box. But for me, this is science. That it functions within these constructions, this artificiality, this artificial marking off. And I'll try to explain it a bit. It's obviously, better explained. There's more explanation in the book, if you want to go there. So I've got Smile saying, most of what we know about science as nature has come from experiments that artificially mark off and isolate a phenomenon from the continual world of the universe, disconnecting that phenomenon from the world of the universe. And I call it doing physics in a box. And this idea of here's my representation of physics in a box. Fairly crude. I'm not a graphic designer. You might have picked that up by now. So this is, but those white lines are important because they're sort of saying, look, we have to leave all that stuff out. We've got to reduce, and so what we give you is what we develop inside the box, and it's pretty powerful inside the box. But the box isn't everything, and there might be things outside the box, that might be important. But but the box is important, and it's important because in part there's a whole lot of different ways of observing, of recording, of scientific instruments. I mean, this is the essence of science to some extent, extending human observational power through the use of these sorts of instruments. But those instruments constrain what we can do. Because we use a microscope, we can see that far. A telescope, we do things differently. A radio telescope, a whole other thing. And they change our abilities to perceive and understand and mark off the world. And so each of these sorts of instruments, and I can only find a few in the images to put in there, but each of those instruments is a particular sort of way of marking off, a way of setting that boundary, so that what we can tell you is perhaps true, or what we know inside the box, or what we've seen inside the box, I guess is the best way of putting it. What we've regularly seen inside the box. And that's what they tell us, and they're very powerful boxes. Okay, I'm not trying to put them down by saying this. I'm just noting this is important for what I want to say next. And there's languages that are scientific languages that we can't speak, and it's those languages are important because You know, they limit what can be said and how it can be said. So once again, the words make for the box, and what scientists can talk about in terms of their particular marking off and studying is in terms of inside the box. And you know, you've got to be careful with that, because the box puts limits. And there are other limits on the box in terms of the people. Scientists are human beings. So there's, you know, human elements to their interactions, and they like status, and they like power, and they like money. Okay, so that's affecting what's going on there. I'm not saying that's, you know, that's a problem. I'm just saying that's present. And because of these reasons, we've got to be very careful about what scientists tell us. Be careful about how they put things. And they told us they knew climate change was happening. They for sure. They had an absolute truth. But they didn't. They didn't. And to some extent, I think we're paying the consequences of that. Because they weren't careful. Because there's smugness. I'm a scientist. I have the truth. I'm a truth teller. You should follow what I tell you because I'm a scientist. That was part of the problem. Only they can work inside their boxes. We can't speak those languages. We can't use those instruments. We can wear white coats, but that's probably about it when it comes to sort of, you know, unless we're trained, unless we've learned how to use that language, those instruments, we've learned how to be inside the box. That's a crucial part of learning to be a scientist. Scientists are, okay, lying bastards are probably a little bit harsh, but I get a little angry sometimes. You know, I think about how foolish they were, and how unsophisticated they were for claiming to know for sure. Because that gave an edge. And when I come to the climate denial industry, you know, I'll come back to these things and I'll come back and talk about this. But this is the way scientists set up the conversation. We have the truth. You do what we tell you. We know. And it just isn't so. We're inside our box. And this is where I owe the apology to the IPCC. You know, I didn't pick it up. I didn't comment on it in the book. You know, I'm sorry. It was a mistake. You know, huge mistake on my part. I just didn't pick up the fact they're being really careful with their language. You know, much more careful than scientists have generally been. And you know, and I need to acknowledge that. And to some extent that helps me because it lets me show you what the climate scientists should have been saying from the beginning. So in there, if we look at, you know, this is just from you know, one of their reports. It's basically explanation for the IPCC, and there's a level of confidence, a level of certainty. That's what we're talking about here. A level of confidence, so I put the square brackets I put in, is expressed using 5 qualifiers. Very low confidence. Not true or false. Not right or wrong. Not absolute true, absolute false. This is, you know, low level of confidence. Or very low level of confidence. Medium level of confidence. High level of confidence. I know this is stuff you weren't expecting, but this is language. And this is what the IPC is doing. We're very confident of this outcome. We're quite, you know, we think there's a medium level of confidence with this outcome, a high level of confidence with that outcome, a low level of confidence with another outcome. Much more careful in the presentation of the so-called knowledge being produced. You know, this is what they've given us. And there's more to it than that, because they were also talking about, you know, virtually certain. Very likely. About as likely as not. I mean, these are, you know, and it's not very scientific in a way, is it? It's not very precise. Well, it is reasonably precise in terms of percentages, but it's real. It's inside the box thinking. That's what it is. Unlikely. Very unlikely. Exceptionally unlikely. I mean, these are the sort of nuance. I mean, perhaps overdoing it, but hopefully you're sort of seeing the change of approach that we're looking at here in terms of, you know, the IPCC, and we've got more terms we can use if we need to. Okay, so we've got extremely likely, more likely than not, more unlikely than likely, extremely unlikely. May also be used when appropriate. And, okay, this may be overkill, but it's really important for me because it's recognition of how scientists should have been talking from the very beginning. And in fact, they weren't. Something that I think has contributed to the problem. But once again, that's all the views expressed in these videos are my own, and that one is particularly my own view. When it comes to people like me and the study of politics, then I've got to also tell you we're part of the problem. We're part of the problem in part because of, I guess, it's the modern way of thinking about politics, one way of doing politics. And it was, for most of us, we talk about Niccolo Machiavelli as a sort of, I don't know, who was the first person I guess we picked up on? It's the Machiavellian view. You would have heard of that. And this is, Machiavelli's a prince, and what he wrote in that book, this is sort of 1469, 1527, and so, at that time, we're seeing the emergence of, this is an early expression of this idea about government, but it's a very powerful idea of government. And this is a prince, it's a government, a ruler. It doesn't, it could be democracy, it could be, obviously in his case it was a monarch, but a prince being often forced in order to maintain the state. And this is, Machiavelli is often criticised for being amoral, but he's saying no, the prince is being forced because he's because Machiavelli was thinking him, could be her. His or her job was to maintain order, in order to maintain the state, to maintain stability, political stability. A prince being often forced, in order to maintain the state, to maintain political stability, to act contrary to honesty, friendship, kindness, and religion. With no sort of reference to morality, I guess, would be the sort of simplest way of talking about that. So when Machiavelli is talking about government, he's saying government's about order, not morals. It's about making sure we don't have, in a sense, as I'll come to argue, fundamental change. So that's Machiavelli and the sort of contribution. Another figure that we can look at is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, his work, Leviathan, another really powerful figure in the way we think about politics. The Machiavellian constraint, it's about order, it's about control and power in order to maintain stability. For Hobbes, the business of the Commonwealth, once again, the business of the government is this: to preserve the peace at home and to defend people against foreign invasion. And so this is the sort of Hobbesian legacy. This is what Hobbes gives us by way of the sort of an understanding of what politics is about, what politics is for. And part of the theme in here is that it's not to do good, not to do moral good. To preserve the people in peace at home and defend them against foreign invasion. That's what government's about. That's what politics is about. There's a phrase that I've come across, and I'll explain a bit why I come across it more than others. Peace, order, and good government. It's something I saw in quite a few constitutions. It turned out they were Commonwealth constitutions of Commonwealth governments. But this is, the important part of this is good government doesn't refer to moral government. So we've got peace, which is sort of order. We've got order, which is order. And we've got good government. But it's not moral good government, it's ordering government. So it's order, order, and order. That's what governments are about. That's what politics is for. That's what political institutions do. That's part of what I was trying to, say political science offered. When I was doing that stuff on, for discipline, disciplined. I was writing that chapter that sort of started this whole process of me writing this book and ultimately eventually making these videos. Anyway, so I came across this and I understood, and I'd seen this term over and over again. And I looked up the variable source Wikipedia and found that the phrase peace, order and good government appears in many 19th, 20th century British Commonwealth Acts of Parliament. That's why I live in a Commonwealth country, that's why I was aware of it. So we've got it in New Zealand, the Constitution Act, the Colonial Laws Validity Act, the British Settlements Act, the Commonwealth of Australia, Constitution Act. That's obviously why I come across it so much, because part of I also teach and do commentary on Australian politics. The South Africa Act, the Hong Kong Letters Patent, West Indies Act, Government of Ireland Act. And all of them contain this phrase, peace, order and good government, and are about, and reflecting this idea that political institutions are about order and order. And if you think about that in another way, what you come up with is an idea of a lack of change. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So this is a book by an author called David Easton. Came out, I think, in the 50s. And this was him trying to make politics into a science, or one of the people trying to make politics into a science. And saying, look, this is the way we need to mark off our universe, and this is the way we need to... so I've sort of got another box, okay, that I want to talk about. And Easton was one of the people who introduced that box. And introduced this idea of political science, which, I made a joke of by wearing a white coat, lab coat for this particular thing. And this is a diagram that sort of expresses what Easton was talking about. And so, it's the political system, the political institutions, they sit in the middle, and inside there you've got parties and other things, so they're not, it's not just Congress, parliaments, and executives and prime ministers and presidents. The judges are also part of that one. So you've got then the political system, so you've got the box, and you've got demands and supports, so that's what people feed in, and then the political system produces decisions or policies, and they come back by way of feedback. Okay, so that's the diagram, that's our model, right? That's our box, the political science box. Okay, and what's important about that box? Well, for me anyway, what's missing is what's important. And fundamental radical change. That's missing. That's been missing to an extent all along. Because Machiavelli's idea about what political institutions are about was order. Maintaining order, even if it meant acting immorally. We're coming to halt. Maintaining order is it, the only job. So when we come to it, and the political scientists, I think, are very much sort of fallen into this idea that, that we don't study institutions that produce fundamental change, radical, at the root, deep change. And that's the sort of change we need. As I was saying in the preceding, if you've watched the preceding video, you've looked at the sorts of changes that climate scientists seem to be suggesting, or people who are working from climate science seem to be suggesting we need to introduce. They're deep changes. Our political institutions aren't being looked at and understood in terms of deep changes. And then there's the environment. I know it's up here at the top, but that's not natural environment. Okay, that's social environment. So the natural environment is not feeding into this story at all. The political institutions are not. And obviously that's going to be a difficult thing to do. But what's missing from this picture is inputs that reflect the natural environment, and outputs, policies that reflect the protection or preservation of the natural environment. So this is something else missing. And most of all, future generations are completely missing. In terms of demand and supports, they've got to come from people there. The inputs. Well, future generations don't exist to input. Therefore, they have no inputs. Therefore, they don't count. Therefore, political institutions work without reflecting their interests. And let's be really clear, the people who have an interest in radical change are young people. People like me are hardly going to be affected. Young people are going to be affected. And the fact that they're missing from this model seems to me to be a sort of crucial thing in terms of the way we're imagining our politics. So when we think about the way we imagine, we think of our politics and the way we practice our science, these are both, it seems to me, factors that have contributed to us moving toward and into the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130. So in this video, what I tried to do was to explain that there's power and there's something else going on in science and the scientists are necessarily admitting. But I also want to talk about the fact that people like me who study politics and the ways that most people understand political institutions means that they're not about producing deep change, the sort of change necessary to prevent us moving into and through the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please follow me on YouTube and Medium.